Hi, Coach Cronk here. I spend a lot of time explaining to the athletes that I coach how to execute their VO2 max intervals properly. On the bike, VO2 max training is not as simple as hitting a prescribed wattage. The goal is actually to accumulate time at or close to maximum oxygen uptake. In this video, I'm going to explain how to execute bike VO2 max intervals properly. And at the end, I'm going to give you my 3 favorite VO2 max interval sessions. This episode is actually part of a series. There's going to be 2 more videos where I explain running VO2 max intervals and also swimming VO2 max intervals. Let's dive in. Power meter is, of course, a great tool to have on the bike, but to do VO2 max intervals well, I think we need to look at several signals together. We have power, we have heart rate. It's great to have accurate heart rate zones when doing these intervals. And then we also have rate of perceived exertion and an awareness of what your breathing is doing. So ideally what we want to do during VO2 max intervals is see our heart rate rise progressively through a session. And we want to accumulate time at that VO2 max zone. Depending on which model you use, might be labeled differently, but typically it's that heart rate zone above threshold. We also need to pay attention to our breathing. So when we get close to or when we're at VO2 max, our breathing actually becomes very gaspy and erratic, far less sort of rhythmical and controlled than it is at lower intensities. I think that's a key change to be aware of and a sensation to try and strive for whilst doing VO2 max intervals. Rate of perceived exertion, or RPE, should rise progressively. So you might start an interval at an RPE of 7 or 8, and you might actually finish an interval or a block of small intervals at more like a 9 or 9.5, say. So the key message here is don't just judge a session based on a wattage target alone. If you do that, you might actually miss the internal sensation that we're looking to achieve through a VO2 max session. So to help me explain why power targets are simply a guide when doing VO2 max intervals on the bike, if we look at a typical VO2 max zone, if we use the popular Coggan model, we can see that the VO2 max zone ranges from about 106% of FTP to 120% of FTP. Already you can see that that is a huge range. So, for example, if you were doing VO2 max intervals that were 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, at 106% of FTP, that's going to feel very, very different to doing a 5, 6, 7 or 8 minute interval at 106% of FTP. And also when we're doing these microbursts, these very short on-off style intervals, they can actually be prescribed much above 120%, sometimes more than 130% of FTP. So the appropriate power target actually depends on the interval duration, the recovery duration, the number of repetitions, the number of sets, and also on the athlete themselves, what type of athlete they are, their training history. You could actually have 2 athletes with identical FTPs that would need very different power targets for the same VO2 max session for them both actually to achieve time at or close to maximum oxygen uptake. That is why it's very, very important to be aware of the sensations that go with training at VO2 max and be able to adjust a session, adjust your own targets, or adjust during the session so that you can achieve that sensation. Broadly speaking, there's 2 types of VO2 max intervals: short intervals and long intervals. Short intervals are typically a minute or less, and they come on-off fashion where you perform the intervals in blocks or sets, such as 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, 30, 15, 40, 20, 1 minute on, 1 minute off. Long intervals are typically in the 3 to 5 minute range, sometimes right up to 8 minutes long, 5 minutes on, 5 minutes off, or a little bit shorter. So something like 5 minutes on, 3 minutes off is common. Both target achieving time at or close to maximum oxygen uptake, but the execution is very different. Now, in an ideal world, when doing these sessions, you're going to have reasonably consistent power across all of your intervals. When looking at heart rate, we want heart rate to rise through each block of short intervals or through each long interval. And as the session goes on, we want our heart rate to spend more and more time in that VO2 max zone. Bear in mind that early on, due to heart rate lag in the first block of intervals or first interval, you might not even see your heart rate in that VO2 max zone. Be patient. Don't chase heart rate from the first interval. Otherwise, it's very easy to go too hard and then really struggle later on in the session. In terms of rate of perceived exertion, you want to start at around sort of 8 out of 10. And then as you get deeper into the session, it's going to feel more like a 9.5 out of 10. If, for example, you've got a block of 30-second on, 30-second off intervals, and you've got 3 blocks, I like to explain to folks that I coach that in that first block, it's probably only the last third of it that really hurts. In that second block, it's probably the last 2/3 of it that hurt. And in that third block, all of it should be uncomfortable. And if you've got long intervals, treat that first interval as an extension of your warm-up. Finish that interval feeling essentially underwhelmed by the effort you've put in, because I promise you, you'll start that second interval and you'll realize, oof, yeah, I've got a tough session ahead. And if you go too hard on that first one, you might really struggle later on in the session. Now, consistent power across all your intervals is nice, but in reality, it's very hard to achieve in a challenging session like this. And personally, I don't think it's essential. Some decline in power is acceptable if you're still producing power in that VO2 max power zone and your heart rate is still staying high and rising into that VO2 max zone, and that breathing sensation is still matching that sensation that goes with being at VO2 max, and your form on the bike is still good as well. What we don't want is power completely falling off a cliff. And what you can also do is, if you're doing, say, a block of 30-second on, 30-second off intervals, and you get to repetition number 7 or 8, and you realize by completing that block, it's going to completely put you over your limits and jeopardize how you can complete the rest of the session, just shut it down after 7 or 8 intervals. Do a smaller block of good quality efforts, take that extra recovery, come into that next block, perhaps having adjusted your expectations slightly, adjust your power targets if you need to, and keep the quality high. I generally avoid using erg mode for VO2 max intervals. The problem with erg mode is that it forces you into a predetermined wattage target, regardless of those internal sensations that we're looking to achieve. Without using erg mode, it allows you to adapt within the session and respond to how you're feeling and adjust so that you can get the best out of the session. For example, if you get 2 or 3 minutes into a 5-minute repetition and you realize that that target is completely unsustainable for the remaining duration of that interval, without using erg mode, you can actually just let your power fluctuate a little bit. You can drop it down by 3 to 5%, say, and keep that effort under a bit more control and complete that 5-minute interval. And 3 to 5% is not that much. So what you'll actually see is that your heart rate is still going to keep rising. That breathing rate is still going to remain elevated, and you're still going to get the sensations that you want from that effort. Picture it this way. If you're doing it outside on a climb and your job was to get to the top of that 5-minute climb, well, if you'd realized you'd started too hard, you wouldn't just pull over and stop, would you? You would just slow down a bit, see if you could get yourself under control and keep pushing forwards till you get to the top. It's essentially the same mindset that you want when doing VO2 max intervals. And also learning how to modulate your power like that whilst keeping an eye on heart rate and breathing is a really valuable pacing skill to learn. If you're feeling good during a VO2 max workout, it is fine to push the effort a little bit harder as you progress through the session, but don't turn it into a hero session. Remember, the gains from VO2 max training are going to come through stacking workouts like this week on week within a block or a few blocks of training. Finish knowing that you trained hard, but not terrified of doing it again. I like to get the folks that I coach to frame VO2 max training sessions as game day. They are demanding, so you do need to arrive fresh. So they generally come in a plan after an easy day or a rest day. So definitely don't put it into your plan the day after another hard interval day or a really long endurance day, for example. I really think moving VO2 max sessions around in your plan is a really bad idea. So game day is how I like to frame it, which means go through a micro process of what you go through for a race. So you want to sleep well before, you want to take care of your fueling, plan your hydration, have all of your equipment ready, devices charged, kit ready. Even if you want to, put on your best kit, your team kit, remove all of those barriers to entry and come into that session feeling like you're really ready to get after it. You can do your VO2 max intervals indoor on the trainer or outdoors. I think that the short on-off style intervals work really well on the trainer. It's just much more easy to be consistent across the session. You also don't generate as much heat as you do when you do the long style of intervals. So bear that in mind. If you do the long intervals inside, your RPE can rise very quickly due to that heat generation. It's good to have a good fan or even multiple fans if you're going to do them inside. That said, you can do both types outside if you have a suitable flat area or a shallow climb, particularly a shallow climb for short style on-off intervals, because you need to be able to go easy enough on that short recovery between the bursts. Doing long style intervals work great on a climb, and you can actually just descend between intervals. Don't cut the recovery periods short just because you've got to the bottom of the hill again. You'll need to just perhaps do a little out and back spin just so you don't cut that short. And most people doing VO2 max intervals can actually put out more power outside than they can do inside. So again, it's another reason why it's super important to have those good heart rate zones and be able to pay attention to that breathing. As promised then, my 3 favorite VO2 max training sessions on the bike in no particular order. First up, we have Ronestad 4020s. After Bent Ronestad, the Norwegian sports scientist who's done a lot of research into this protocol, 3 times 13 40 seconds on, 40 seconds off. Sometimes 4 times 13 is possible also. Somewhere between 5 and 8 minutes recovery between sets. And as a starting guide, 115 to 125% of FTP for those 40-second bursts. Take the recovery nice and easy. 20 seconds is not a lot. It's going to fly by. As mentioned before, don't go too hard in that first block. Let the effort come to you. What we want to see is that heart rate ratchet upwards as the block of short intervals progresses. We want to see it go up more and more and more and come down less and less between the intervals. It's okay for your power to decline a little bit through a block, as so long as you still feel like you can ride with good form, get that leg speed up, push the pedals hard and get that breathing rate up and see that heart rate still climbing through the block. A really powerful session, this one. And I think that short on-off style intervals are a great introduction to VO2 max training. Because you've got lots of intervals, there's almost less chance that you'll get the session wrong. If you drop a couple of intervals here or there, you're still going to accumulate loads of time at high power and at that high oxygen uptake. Next up, 6 times 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off. So we've got that 1-to-1 work to rest ratio here. At a starting guide, 110 to 120% of FTP. Of course, you can be a little bit outside of that range if you need to be. Keep that first repetition deliberately controlled and almost part of the warm-up, if you like. Take that full 3-minute recovery. Don't cut it short. This is a great session to do outdoors on a suitable climb. And also with these long intervals, indoors or outdoors, you can play around a little bit with being in or out of the saddle. Try not to get out of the saddle to sort of rescue the interval because power is really, really fading. You don't want to just get out of the saddle just to manipulate the average power. Get out of the saddle because it feels right to do it in the moment, perhaps because the terrain is changing a little bit. And also it's more natural to do that outside when you're working hard as well. You obviously want to get your heart rate up into that VO2 max territory and again, see it happening earlier and earlier into each repetition as it progresses. Don't worry if it doesn't get there in interval 1. Thirdly, 5 times 5 minutes, but with a 30-second hard start to kick off each 5-minute interval. Okay, so typically The hard start can be anywhere from 125 to 140% of FTP. And then we drop down to 4.5 minutes at anywhere from 103 to 110% of FTP. So you can see they're quite big ranges there, and it's going to vary a lot from person to person. The harder you go during that hard start, probably the lower that power is going to be for the 4.5 minute section. So you can play around with these intervals a little bit. But the reason why we do the hard start is because it's going to drive that oxygen demand up and get that heart rate and breathing rate up much earlier into the interval. So the thinking is you can actually spend more time at or close to maximum oxygen uptake. A great session to do outdoors on a climb, and you can play around with doing that hard start out of the saddle, in the saddle, combination of both. So some key things to remember. There isn't really one magical VO2 max workout. Ideally, you should be using a combination of them, and the types that you use will also depend on what time of year it is, what type of athlete you are, and what you're working towards. Remember that when you're executing these, don't blindly chase the power number that a session has prescribed you. You need to use a combination of power and heart rate and your breathing and rate of perceived exertion. Now, you absolutely can do these intervals just on rate of perceived exertion or with heart rate as well, and pay attention to those things so that you can learn how to respond and improve your pacing of these with experience. These can be quite intimidating sessions when you're new to them, but the more you do it, the more comfortable you will become with the discomfort, if you like. If you have any questions, please do drop them in the comments below and I'll get back to you. If you'd like to talk to me about coaching, I'll leave my contact details below also. Keep a lookout for the VO2 Max running intervals episode and swimming intervals episode. Thanks for watching. Good luck with your training and racing.